Good evening and welcome to the Des Moines Art Center and to Conversations on Art with the artists Phyllida Barlow and Senior Curator Gilbert Vicario. I'm Jeff Fleming, Director of the Art Center. It's my pleasure to have you here. This presentation tonight accompanies a major exhibition of Barlow's work, which opens here Thursday night. And as you will soon see, this is a project like no other. And we will be talking about this one for years to come. Barlow has an extraordinary history. She taught numerous notable young British artists at the Slade School of Fine Art in London, as well as other schools in London, for nearly 40 years. Her students included Douglas Gordon and Rachel White Reed, among others. I had the great fortune of walking through the Art Center galleries the other day, and Phyllida was talking about various artists in the collection that she knew when they were students, such as Cecily Brown. And although she has always made art, Barlow and her work have received an enormous amount of attention since her retirement from teaching in 2009. Her sculpture is included in the current Venice Biennale, and she recently had a projects exhibition at the New Museum in New York. Barlow's colossal art commands a stage. Her sculptures aggressively demand attention and strong-arm the viewer's engagement, in part simply by occupying his or her space. Overwhelming their allotted elbow room, the work psychologically and physically assail the spectator with their size and presence. Made of manipulated, found, and often recycled materials, Barlow focused on materiality and scale, as well as a thoughtful relationship to architecture. This presentation, along with the exhibition, is supported by the National Endowment for the Arts and Substance Architecture. Media support of tonight's lecture is provided by Iowa Public Radio. This evening, we're also honored to partner with the International Sculpture Center in an ISConnects event in which the ISC shares work of contemporary artists and unique viewpoints of sculpture with its members and the public alike. ISC has a table in the rear, and so I encourage you to visit. The survey that was passed out earlier, please fill it out and turn it in. This will help them gather information for funding and other sources. But for now, please welcome Phyllida Barlow and Gilbert Vicario.
Well, Jeff, thank you so much for that really great introduction. You're making my job that much easier. I'm just going to cross off that paragraph. Good evening, and thank you so much for coming out on this almost summer evening. It's a really wonderful time, actually, to be opening an exhibition. I'm very happy to have Phyllida in Des Moines and to be able to welcome her and have her come out this evening in anticipation for her exhibition, which is entitled Scree. But I will let Phyllida talk a little bit more about that later on in the presentation. As some of you already know, there are actually two parts to the exhibition. In the Anna K. Meredith Gallery, there's a grouping of 56 of Phyllida's drawings executed between 1965 and this year, in conversation with over 16 works from our permanent collections, selected by Phyllida. The second part of the exhibition is located in the I.M. Pei wing of the museum, and we'll just have to wait until Thursday to unveil that. For now, please join me in welcoming Phyllida to the Des Moines Art Center and to hear a little bit about Phyllida's thoughts on art, sculpture, and where she began and where she's going. And by the way, and just to let everyone know, I'm going to be controlling the slides. So
is that a threat?
It's
so it's a real honor to be here, and I just can't thank the Des Moines Art Center enough for giving me this absolutely incredible opportunity, which is to be able to play with the IM Pei space. I can't think of anything more incredible for an artist to have that opportunity to be able to do what they like in such an incredible venue. So I'm really, really grateful. I think when I came here last year, it was very stark and very careful how the space was used, and very dignified. And but what I left with was an incredible sense of height, openness, and the inside entering the space from the outside, and that almost as though this material that we see here had its own transparency. Although it's incredibly solid, there was a feeling that the building was incredibly related to the outside world around. And I think we came in winter, didn't we? It was a very different season to now.
Actually, it was September.
September,
so
late
October.
September. Yeah. Right.
So I think there were still leaves on the trees.
There were leaves, but I don't remember it being this lush and this vivid. But I think it was the different kinds of spaces and the incredible flight of the ceiling, which is almost like an aircraft. It's almost like wings that are going straight through the glass windows. That was a great inspiration. And I think what made me really want to do things with the space was to make the space, that is the empty bits between the walls, and the walls become a kind of material that could be manipulated as much as the things that I put in there. And I suppose my great love of sculpture has been about the fact that, for me, sculpture isn't necessarily about an image. It's about the encounter that you, as a human being, have with the presence of something which isn't human, and that there is this thing that you're almost in an animal kind of way invited to investigate it, to walk around it, to stalk it, and it can never quite be held as an image in the same way that a painting can be, so that you're perhaps constantly losing the image that you held 2 seconds before. And I'm intrigued by that. I'm intrigued by that way in which the very substance of sculpture has the potential to dissolve in front of you, even though it may be 10 tons of concrete or whatever it may be made of. It still has this possibility to be elusive in some way.
Michael Fried talks about this idea of intentionality, which he says in painting and photography, an artist has almost complete control over his or her intentions in that frame, in that two-dimensional space, thereby almost suggesting that sculpture is somehow inferior because you can't completely control the intention, because of exactly the fact of what you were describing as the ability to walk around, of having more of a subjective encounter.
And gravity.
And gravity.
You know, there's a lot of language in art about things like intuition, spontaneity, even gesture. Now, in painting, or, you know, I imagine a painter can, you just have to look at the fabulous little Joan Mitchell here, and you can sort of feel time trapped in this little canvas. And I have a fascination to know what the last mark on that painting might have been, and why she decided to stop making any more marks on that painting. And I think that's intriguing process. In sculpture, if you try and do that with the materiality of sculpture, whether it's welding or carving or building in clay or assembling in the way I do, you first of all got to gather your materials in order to do that gesture. And you're already in a time frame that's slower, that's in a way more ponderous. What you then try and do with an action may be quick, but you've got that physicality in a way against you. And I suppose I like that sense of something resisting that, but the challenge of, at the same time, of trying to retain a kind of immediacy in how the work might come together. But I think sculpture is the biggest liar of all the art mediums, because, you know, even if you get a sense of being able to place things quickly, almost in a move, you've then got the problem of, are they fixed, or is it just going to collapse in front of you?
The minute you approach it from another angle,
it
completely undermines.
Yes, yeah.
You know.
I also think, and this isn't a negative thing, that sculpture has a built-in flaw. And I think that suits some artists very well, especially an artist like myself, who maybe isn't a total perfectionist, you know, or has an obsessive trait, but not a perfectionist trait, and is interested in approximation rather than exactness, you know. And I think that's, although we can think of artists like Jeff Koons and many other sculptors where there's an incredible precision in their work, I think often those sculptors are actually more about image and less about what I would call a sculptural language, which to me is very time-based and very much about the interaction between you, a viewer, as a sort of protagonist with the...
Well, I think in your work, it's somewhat there's a midpoint where between the real world, objects in that world, versus the other spectrum, the other end of the spectrum, which is sculpture.
Yes.
Which can be very artificial, which that artificiality is in fact exaggerated in the work of Koons, let's say.
Yes.
And I think your practice resides somewhere in the middle, where there is perhaps an ambiguity between, you know, whether this is an object or a sculpture.
Yes.
Really playing with that and seeing how that's positioned within the world. But I'm wondering, I'm going to start advancing forward a few images. It would be interesting to hear about how you've arrived at your thoughts on sculpture, and what are the historic precedents or influences, perhaps, that we can talk a little bit about here.
This is, I'm sure most of you know, Picasso's Glass of Absinthe, of which there were 11.
It was a big edition, though.
Yes,
Yeah.
edition. I don't know whether it was an edition. They're all unique
There was one in
pieces, aren't they?
Philadelphia, I remember.
Yes,
when I was there.
yeah.
They were-
And for me, it was made in 1921, I think. But I think it came from they were actually made much earlier than that, but they sort of came out into the world in 1920. And I think, for myself, although it's perhaps a very inaccurate and not completely correct art historical statement, I think it proclaims sculpture as a 20th century art form, in the sense that it achieves everything. It is both an object that you have to walk around, and it's often shown from this, the images are often from this kind of glamour shot view, where you get the sugar slice and the cube and everything in perfect arrangement, so you can see the maximum amount of the object. The other side of it is very, very different indeed, but it's got...
Is it as photographed as much, or it's never
photographed? It's like, to me, that is a whole other thing
That's
about
a whole
sculpture.
other thing, yeah.
The glamour shot that is trying to show you the best view
like the
of
best
a piece.
profile.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think of a work like even the Brancusi upstairs, you don't get an image of that where you don't see that front.
Exactly.
And yet the whole point is that you see the aspect of a sculpture which is more blank, less front-looking. But this work has absolutely everything in it that I think the 20th century has been doing battle with in terms of sculpture. It's hollowed out, it's convex and concave, it's painted, the shadows are painted, which is like playing with illusion in it. It's got a ready-made or a found object in it.
Yeah.
It's both a kind of abstracted version of a glass and actually a glass. It's playing with all these things and leaving you with an utterly autonomous thing in its own right. And that's why I suppose I find it absolutely consistently amazing as a work. And I think it's only about 7 inches high, 7.5 inches high. Louise Bourgeois, which you have in your museum, the most eminent version of. I like this version as well. I think it's quite alarming, you know, the red and the black. It's very different from the pink. But talk about an object that's animated and anthropomorphic without any indication of human qualities. It's like something on tiptoes. It's stealth, it's moving by stealth, and it's perched in this extraordinary way. And I suppose I'm intrigued by sculpture that isn't necessarily always sort of challenging gravity through its perilous way of existing. Eva Hess making these works flat on the ground, having no idea how they should behave beyond how they're made, and then suspending them and allowing them to just behave how they want to behave as suspended objects, but becoming, in my opinion, a completely sculptural experience through almost like a sequence, a time sequence of different processes.
Negative space.
Yes. Matter Clark, Gordon Matter Clark, a kind of hero of mine, and somebody who it would be impossible to ever compete with. An incredible climber, mountain climber, so he would climb into these buildings with very little permission and absolutely zero health and safety, and cut these enormous holes out of them. And before the Pompidou Center was built, I don't know if any of you have seen the old 16mm film he took of before the demolition workers moved into the site where the Pompidou Center is. He did this, he cut his way through the buildings there and filmed it as he went. It's an amazing film, but utterly sculptural in the sense that he was sort of manipulating both space and the materiality of the thing There's an incredible image of when they'd finally cut this shape out of them all on the inside with the shape just lying on the floor, and that's all the work is just cutting this massive section out of the building, revealing its interior space. An adventure. It's the adventure there that I find so compelling.
Do you think during this time period there was more of interest on artists' parts to what was happening in New York? It seems like a lot of the innovations that were happening in sculpture in relation to minimalism and conceptual art were coming out of New York. Is that how you remember it at the time?
I remember it as that, but then it traveled across the Atlantic a bit slower, you know. I think this is 71, and he died in, does anyone know when he died? Was it 73 or 78, was it? I can't remember. But
Smithson died in 73.
So, in fact, the first bourgeois images I saw were in about 63, 62, which were of the personages, you know. And then the first Eva Hesses I saw were in about 66, when she was already in Germany, and I think they were in an art magazine then. But I remember the sort of shock of beginning to piece together this non-European history, you know, that was happening across the Atlantic.
Well, so then what was happening in London at the time?
It was still, there was a succession of extremely famous shows called at the Whitechapel Art Gallery, which was first new sculpture, then new painting, where the then curator Brian Robertson tried to bring into 60s London this break with the sculptural tradition of that time, which was very much out of Henry Moore.
Okay.
And it was painted sculpture. And Anthony Caro, you know, who, yeah, he was in that show.
Okay.
Yeah. Bruce Nauman, incredible artist. These are works from the 70s, and just very briefly, I think with these whole series of sculptures from the 70s, what I love about them, I suppose that feeling that you don't know quite whether it's finished or not. And for me, the idea of incompletion is fascinating, as opposed to something having this definite gloss of finish on it. I like the feeling that with something as recalcitrant and as difficult as sculpture, you can keep it still in a state of aliveness, which I think Bruce Nauman with these works really did.
I love that word, recalcitrant.
Yes.
It's a great word.
Yeah.
I think of
Well,
contingency as well. It's
Yes.
a contingency.
Like a lot of
Unfinished.
people who make, like myself, there's a real love-hate relationship going on, you know. It's not...
With what? Love-hate relationship?
Well, with making.
With making.
And the thing that you're doing with making, you know, which is taking up space, and the thing you're making is useless. It has no real service to the world whatsoever. And especially, and if you're like me or interested in the adventure of making, it's like, it can seem like this absolutely futile self-indulgence, you know.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I think there's something that's about, I hope, that's about the human spirit there.
Well, that's a perfect segue to your early work,
Oh, right.
which is all about, it's all about process, it's all about making, but it's also about recycling and discarding, if I understand it correctly. But I'll let you fill us in a little bit on this, on these early, on
Yes.
basically your process.
The
of
drawings
this.
from 1965 up in the gallery at the moment show colored images of the works I was making prior to these. So these sort of came after I'd kind of been introduced
right.
to Arte Povera and Eva Hesse. And so I was deeply, with the work on the audience's left, I was right in the throes of discovering how actions and recycling of materials and using very lowly, humble materials had a whole possibility, a whole vocabulary to explore. So the work on your left is made out of, I think it's 400 discarded painting stretchers. And then I sort of adapted them and used the canvas off these stretchers to turn them into these pieces that could be bound round the stretchers. And so the object began with a central cube about that side, and I just kept on adding to it, tying to it and tying to it. Again, I think it was an important work for me because I realized it could have gone on and on and on. And it was that kind of idea of a potential, a life beyond just the moment that it becomes finished. The finish isn't, it's one of many possible finishes. And the little work on the audience is right, is 10 years later. It's actually 1982, so we've missed out a great chunk of work. But I had, by the stage that I was making these little works, which are called night works, I had 5 children, and it was very difficult to get into the studio. So I decided that I would work late at night. And it was a struggle, you know, it was a struggle to get, it was a struggle financially, it was a struggle in every way, just
and
to
you were teaching
retain.
during the day.
I was getting back into teaching,
Okay.
yes. And so I sorted it out that my husband would stay listening for the children, and I would go into the studio, which is attached to the house, and I didn't know what to do. It was like a blank, but I knew I wanted to handle materials, so I turned the studio lights off and worked in the dark, having prepared the materials, and then I began to just make these things by touch and rather than through an image, and they were, as a result, they were very important. So this one was sort of built around my, you know, being able to fit my arm into the hollow that's there, yeah. And that sort of triggered a whole discussion in my head about the physicality of sculpture being much more important to me than both maybe an idea or an image. It was very much about trying to understand process and how that might drive a work and leave a work in this state of abeyance, neither finished, neither begun, completed, you know, in a state of flux. And then again, we moved forward 10 years. And I think when we left art school, my husband and I, the biggest thing that we felt we could achieve, and I thought that was the norm, and I'm only saying that because I feel for young artists now, and I spend a lot of time with young artists, so I sort of know what the hell they're going through. But when we left art school in '66, the aim was just to get a studio, and that sort of meant you an artist, and that was the thing to achieve. And the idea of getting exhibitions and even getting a gallery, I think, didn't really occur to us or my generation as much as it does now. And I think we just thought we would get teaching jobs, which we were lucky to do, and that in a way was the patron to making the work. But as time progressed, I began to become fascinated in how you get exhibitions and what exhibitions are and what happens if you don't get an exhibition. Are you dead as an artist, you know? And where does art end up? So I began to think about, you know, art ending up in a polite way on people's mantelpieces or people's walls and things. And then I thought, well, what if the object isn't appropriate for those kind of venues, you know? And so I thought about the uninvited object, the object that's a kind of parasite to a host venue, and the way it has a certain rudeness about it, or these objects that were objects for particular places, like for a library or an armchair or a sitting room, are really, in a way, trying to use what I think is exciting about sculpture, a certain sort of discomfort about where these objects might end up. And I think that maybe there isn't a certain interest I have in sculpture as an aggressive art form, not a passive art form, but a very active art form that's taking up spaces where other things might be. And I think that's what this object is for. Also the idea of objects that sort of confront, so the sort of blank facade that is semi-decorated, half decorated. Again, this idea of an object that is neither one thing or another. I think a lot of the a lot of the sources of my work come from things that I do see, and they're often things that are very conspicuous. They're often things that we all see and have to negotiate, whether it's on the street or in the domestic environment. But I like the idea of taking that and seeing how I remember them. And so it's often to do with the slippage in memory about very familiar things that we would all know about, whether it's street furniture or other kinds of objects that we have around the house or on the street. These aren't things that have any mystery about them in terms of their origins.
And I just wanted to mention, we were talking a little earlier about baby grand pianos. And does this go back to that?
Yes, this was one of the first ones. Yes, the other half of this work has the first grand piano I used that was a very fat, chunky object. And this is using the sort of piano shape, the kind of curved front of a grand piano. But this one, I was, in a way, stealing from Louise Bourgeois'.
I was just going to mention.
Yes, yeah, Blind Leading the Blind, the idea of trying to make something very heavy be propped up on these spindly legs. I mean, sculpture is so often about how is it going to stand up, how is it going to fall over, how is it going to break, and all those things which absolutely fascinate me. And I must say I get a sort of thrill in when some of my work does fall over, because it does. And I've had a lot of...
Then you're in for a treat.
Yes, no, it's not going to do it up there.
Oh, here's the infamous Dallas exhibition.
Yes. This was in 2003. I was on a fellowship at the University of Texas in Dallas. There was a contact we had there called Rick Bratell, who ran the art history department at that place, and he was trying to open up this very science-based, computer-based section of the University of Texas by introducing an art component in it. And I think I was one of the first people to go there to use this very complicated gallery. But what was great about this was that I realized I wanted to make the work really reach up into this extraordinary ceiling that's a bit like one of those. It reminded me of the opening sequence of Alien, you know, with all these air conditioning
the air
tubes.
ducts and everything.
And I thought, rather than trying to run away from that or pretend it was a squeaky clean white cube, get the work up into that area, which fascinated me, and make the work compete with that. And also, as it was a thoroughfare for the students to go from one bit to another, I decided to bisect it with this ramp, and this was the beginning of this sort of fascination with ramps. I've always been fascinated in stages, but this was much a stage, as in a theatrical stage, like the thing we're sitting on that.
Can you tell everyone what one of the students, one of the comments that you got?
Oh yes, as part of my deal for being a fellow, having this fellowship I had to take I had to be the teacher for these classes, which were classes in trying to get science students to look at art. And so one of the easier ones was that all the students had to write was a criticism of this exhibition. And there were 400 students in the class. And so I got these 400 pieces of paper, all with comments of the show, most of which were extremely negative. And, which, I mean, always fascinates me, because I don't think, as an artist, you should just expect your work to be liked. You know, I think you have to take it on the chin. But this one in particular I pulled out was that the work was the work of Satan, because because it was very ugly and God's world was beautiful. And so I got this out and I said, this really interests me. You know, I'd like to find out about ugliness and beauty. And so the young chap stood up and said, yes, it was he who had written it. So I said, well, what is beautiful? And said, well, God's world is perfect. Everything he made is perfect. And so I said, well, what about when things go wrong in life, or when, you know, somebody gets ill? And he said, that's because they've let Satan in. So I thought, right, we're in for a interesting ride here. But we did end up discussing beauty, and a lot of people participated. And that was really fantastic. His idea of beauty was Texas. You know, he said that is. and you know, actually, I thought it was really amazing to be able to, out of that, have a discussion that was so vivid and vital, and everybody participating just around the subject of beauty, you know. But their main criticisms was that they didn't think I'd finished making the work, you know. So it was actually a really amazing experience to stay then. So I'm not just making fun of this one person.
And so then actually almost 10 years later, was the new museum? Was it 9 years?
Yes, it was.
Wow.
Yes.
Okay.
So we're going in decades.
Going in decades. Okay,
Yeah.
I think we're going now into the section of selected works. It's amazing, since your retirement from teaching in, was it 2009?
Yes.
How many exhibitions do you think you've had? In that relatively, it seems like such a small.
Yes.
Even though you've been working for many years, somehow.
Yes, it's
seems
been
significant.
very. I think it's also the size of the venues that I've had that has been so extraordinary.
They just exponentially
Yes.
have grown. And
Yeah.
this was an exhibition called Depot,
Yes,
but I'm not
yeah.
sure
Well,
where.
just, I mean, it may be a bit tedious. The doorway into this exhibition was that big. So every single component had to be made that size and then joined together in there. And I liked that challenge. And as I brought the things in, I realized that where I placed them was just as good as anywhere else that I might place them. So I just brought the work in, assembled it in kit-like form, and then left it. And it sort of made me think of the way a warehouse might operate, or a depot for, you know, bringing stuff in and taking stuff out. That the idea of where you might, as we've been doing in the Meredith, of pulling things forward and then back a bit, it's a kind of artifice, isn't it? And then here it was almost like saying this is a storage space where things could come and go. And I found that very informative about how you almost try and set up sculpture.
Yeah, it almost sounds like you're adrift in this, or there's no anchor, visual anchor.
Absolutely, yes.
So I think that was kind of the challenge. Yes. And this is also part of that exhibition.
Yes, this was also this interest in what is the back of a sculpture, what is the front of a sculpture, and all these issues, I suppose, about why there is a best side to a sculpture. It's incredible coming in every day and walking past the Rodin, you know, and Rodin's relationship with back, you know, backs, as Adam, my studio manager, was saying, that wonderful quote of his, get the front right and the back will look after itself. And I think it's very true of that piece. You know, you can see the clay is almost growing into the back from the front, and it's fantastic feeling about the mobility of the back. Spaces where you can have the possibility to see a work from above as well as at the level that you enter it, I find tremendously exciting. And at Houser-on-Worth in London on Piccadilly, I was able to have that opportunity as well. I don't know if we'll come to those slides, but this show, you came into it at floor level. If you just flick on, that. So I made this wall of taped together structures,
and then
there's the people up there. Yeah.
Was this in London?
Newcastle upon Tyne, which is in the northeast of England. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is that where you were born?
Newcastle, yes. Yeah. I don't think that was their reason for having. And always this thing of tall objects that reach up into the highest points of the space. I find it just tremendously exciting. The other day, at the very nice occasion for the print, somebody asked me about the bigness of sculpture. And I think, yes, my sculpture is big, but I never think of it as big. It's more to do with about an investigation in the space. It's a way of my curiosity about the space. So it's more like, almost like a way of walking around the space or being able to climb around the space, which is very bizarre because I can't even stand on a chair without getting vertigo. So I make everybody else go and do these things.
Well, I think this whole notion of bigness in sculpture also has a lot to do with the current state of art galleries in New York, which seem to be growing bigger and bigger.
Yes, yes. There's obviously a huge competition going on,
there's
no one's told us about.
Yeah, exactly. But it's this idea, if a gallery gets bigger, does that mean the art inside will meet that challenge?
Oh, sometimes you have a sort of hilarious experience with sculpture that, this was in the front of what's called the Royal Academy of Arts, which is a noble institution founded in the 18th century and is run by its artists and very respectable. And they invited me to do what they call the Courtyard Commission there, which is the sort of entrance to the Royal Academy. And so I did this very kind of, very much like a painting, I think, painted wooden structure. But I hadn't realized that right in front of it was a Damien Hirst, which you can just see the leg of there. Now, everybody came to see the Damien Hirst, and as they photographed it, they'd walk backwards into this really annoying other sculpture, which was mine, so they could never get far enough back to get the whole of this massive Damien Hirst. This was a work where it went to Korea, and they had to assemble it over there. So I decided to do it almost like a kit with all the instructions written on the outside of the work, and each piece comes apart and is then taped together. So I just had to send it in a series of boxes with just masses of tape and ask them, I said they could tape it together in any way they liked. And the stick going through it sort of holds the whole thing together.
Phyllida, we're going to kind of go a little bit quicker.
Okay, yes, sorry, you tell me to shut up.
No. So we have a few, I'm not sure if they're related to...
They're related to a show in Mexico. I sent these drawings to 10 architectural students in Mexico, in Leon, and told them to get on with it. And they did. They were amazing. I mean, they just went out and salvaged these materials. Nothing, there was no...
This was in Leon?
Leon, yes. So everything was salvaged. They all knew about that because that was the way they'd been brought up. You didn't have to buy anything. You just collected what you could, and then I said I wanted the structure to be made very lightly, but when I went there, it was built like a motorway. You could have driven a 10-ton. Their ability to make was just phenomenal. So, in fact, what I had to do when I get there was start to take it apart. And if you go forward.
And this is also kind of an early precursor to what we are presenting here,
yes,
which
definitely.
I think is also, I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, it's about this way
that
of
sloping
yes,
structure with these
exactly.
jutting out.
Yeah, and then as we sort of removed bits from it, the pile of stuff that had been removed grew in one corner, and then if you go forward, keep going forward. Yes, they're rather repetitive, sorry. Yeah. So
I might have deleted some of
them. I don't think you've deleted
the
slide if you just... So whenever we got to something, we made these bundles of material that we just shoved into the underneath of it and then we, Yes, and then all the material that we took out, we just turned into these banners that we hung out of the window as a kind of announcement of the exhibition. It was, I think we had 5 days to make it in.
Wow.
So it was really a tremendous thrill working with these extremely capable people. Very
this
young.
idea of the balconies, which we have one balcony in our show here, did that come from that?
Yes, and banners and flags as very sort of sculptural interventions on buildings, like prosthetic devices that...
But the balcony has a very, very specific resonance in British, would you say, in British culture?
I would say in European culture. I mean, you just have to think of Romeo and Juliet, as a sort of symbol of the balcony as quite a romantic prop in a way.
Right.
And also as an architectural folly, I think. That's what.
Exactly. Yeah.
But I suppose more than anything, this show is about these awnings rather than balconies.
Right.
But they share similar, I think, architectural interventions on buildings.
Let me see. I'm going to move.
Yeah. Let's just move on.
Okay. Let me know when. I was almost going to go up to the Haus der Kunst.
Where's the little baby? I think objects that have a certain mobility about them, like banners and flags, fascinate me as a sculptural phenomenon, you could say. Banners which so often are on the street and as a sort of movable thing which travels through streets, or we've seen so many images on the news and on television of the banner as a way of informing the world now about a political state, or a highly organized event, like you might get these vast North Korean events. So it sort of covers the whole spectrum, from the quite humble individual, shouting their protest or announcing their state of mind to the world, to a mass, orchestration.
Well, I guess that's kind of what I was thinking of in relation to the balcony, because they kind of have there's a similar way that balconies are used politically.
Yes, yes,
The
yeah,
way
the
of
famous
proclaiming or
image of the Czechoslovakian president with Khrushchev and the other one, Brezhnev. And then there's him there, and then when he fell out of favor, he's erased from the balcony photograph. So there's just this weird space where he no longer exists. Yeah. Talking of politics. This is in Nuremberg, and the building is the dairy that was built in the 30s and then was appropriated by Hitler to, be the dairy for supplying his troops with food for the rallies that they had there. It's an absolutely fantastic building. But I couldn't help being very affected by being in Nuremberg, because I suppose I was born in 1944, so I think those of us who are born in the 40s or earlier, obviously, but I think maybe being born on that date when the war was just ending, but certainly in London, you saw you grew up in the 50s until there was this tremendous regeneration in the 60s, and the sort of lights were turned on in the 60s, if you know what I mean. In the 50s, I suppose my sister and brother and I, we grew up with this very damaged city, and then it was incredible. I went to Germany with my parents first in 1951, and we stood in front of Cologne Cathedral. I just remember my mother weeping and photographing me and my sister standing in the rubble, because they wanted to go back to visit friends that they had known before the war. But I couldn't help having that kind of emotional feeling to going to Nuremberg, but of course it's a transformed city. It's rebuilt because the British and the Allied forces flattened it. So there are all these sort of consequences that are very complicated, emotionally, I think. And so being in this incredible building was a really extraordinary experience and a wonderful experience, really incredible. This was all in Nuremberg, these works. And then drawings, I draw the whole time, really, and the drawings are either done for the sculptures, during the sculptures, after the sculptures. They come in all. They're either a resource that's culled from things I've seen or things I want to make. This is the Hauser and Wirth Gallery in Piccadilly, where you go in on ground level, and then you go upstairs and you see this sculpture again from above. So it was that incredible, this is it from above. So it becomes this kind of highly colored landscape when you get up to the middle floor. I like that idea of being able to turn a sculpture upside down. You can actually get to it, get to places of it that you usually might not see. And then this is the basement of the building. I think when I was thinking about this exhibition, the basement, there's lots of very small rooms, and it was almost as though making a series of works which looked as if they'd been left behind or had no...
It's the original bank.
Yes, that's the bank safe. I think my work has a lot to do with theatricality, but I have two studios, one where the big works are made, and then a studio next to my house where I make these small works. And these small works are really, in a way, the heart of my whole activity. I think everything comes out of them. Oh yeah. So I like the idea of the sculpture as, in a way, a performance, and it's a performance both in terms of putting the work up, but in terms how people might encounter it, where they become a kind of protagonist in relationship to the work itself. They're not, I would hope they're not excluded from it. You know?
Well, this was my first encounter with your work.
Yes, oh right, yeah.
This is how I came to, like, who is this Phyllida Barlow? I've never heard of her. And of course, in terms of how it approached this incredible space with such a amazing history.
Yes, yes.
It really, it asserted itself. It really just, you know,
And
you ended up
yeah.
negotiating around it, which is a very different experience.
I think
from
it's
most sculpture.
also interesting for artists about which works are, in a way, going to be kind of universally liked by almost everyone who encounters them. I don't mean this as an arrogant thing, but you just don't know as an artist at all. And that's sort of what drives one on in some ways, you know, it's that unpredictability in taking it on. But everybody seemed to really like this pink work, which is perhaps one of the worst made works I've ever made. So when it went to Basel
Right.
and was actually sold, it was like, oh my God, you know, now what, they're just going to have a heap of dust when they get this back to wherever they want. So we then had to go out to as a team for 10 days and work in Switzerland on it to get it up to some sort of reasonable specification that the...
Well, that was, I mean, originally this is what I wanted to show, to bring to Des Moines.
I know, and I forbade it
You
because
forbade
I couldn't... I had no idea
So
what...
now this looks like the baby compared to what's
Yes,
growing
yes,
upstairs.
yes, yeah.
And here's a good shot of some of the balconies.
Yes, yeah, yeah. This was,
We'll kind of continue. I think we're almost running out of time. I haven't gotten the sign yet. So we'll just keep going. And this one relates obviously to the show that you had in London a few years before. There were the arches in the basement.
yes, a year before, yes.
A year before, okay.
Yeah, and I wanted to use that same curling over shape to
Right.
indicate that maybe the building was kind of holding those forms in check.
Yeah. We were actually going to bring this piece to Des Moines, but it just didn't work out. But the intention was that this was going to be installed in Lower Pay.
Yes, yeah.
And just
yeah.
really fill that. There are 21 of them, I believe.
Yes, yes. The idea of this new museum space, if any, I'm sure some of you know it, but it's quite a fiendish space. It's a difficult space. And you come straight out of the lifts, straight into it. There's no compromise about how you enter that space. And I thought it was very like entering backstage, as though you were coming into the back of a stage, and the front of the stage would be this wall on the right here. That's where a potential audience might be. So I made the whole show be something that you walked straight into, which was those arches, you know, that kind of almost blocked you from then seeing what was quite a empty use of the space. You know. I think one thing that a lot of sculptors have is real problems with the camera and photography. You know, especially if the work isn't just about that one image, glamour shot type of object, you know, where you have to, in a way, be standing in relationship to these to understand them, or like with the Bruce Naumans as well. You don't really get an idea with the Bruce Naumans that they're about that high, you know, they're massive things, you know, they look like...
Well, and unfortunately they get circulated, and most people's understandings are based on photography.
The image, it's absolutely extraordinary. That is the way it works, yeah.
It was that way for a lot of Eva Hess, you know, when they started doing research.
Yes,
10 or 15 years ago, many of the images, they had only had one, that image that was taken 30 years ago. So
yes, it's very interesting, I think. It's almost like a myth is created out of something that's not a whole story, you know. And this work,
I'm sorry.
This work is here now.
So that's
But
the
much
only
better,
pre-existing, it's the only pre-existing piece. Everything else in the show was made specifically for Des Moines.
It seems to be, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yes, yeah.
For those of you who hadn't already heard this, the show, the work was completed, I believe, in late March or mid-March of this year.
Yes.
Was then packed up and filled 4 sea containers.
Yes.
That made its way across the Atlantic to New York, then trucked to Chicago, and then from Chicago to Des Moines. So it's quite a
journey.
It's quite a journey.
Yeah.
I think some of the final images we're going to show are of the drawings, which
some of which are upstairs as well. Yeah. But just to say, the balcony piece, I think now in Des Moines is so much. I so much prefer it. Actually, it's really, the space is fantastic here. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Well, we can just continue.
These are all works which try and get up into the height of the building there. Yeah.
I like these installation shots because it's, I think, perhaps one of the reasons why I wanted to combine the drawings with the works in our permanent collection. It seems like the work here.
Yes, well, when we arrived here, I and my assistants, they'd stripped this gallery out of all the art, and it just seemed behind the walls was then the fantastic collection in the Aachen Forum Museum, really. And I said, why have you removed it from the walls, you know? And so they said, well, let's bring it back in again. And it was just terrific to go into their collection and say, let's have these paintings. So
it was a little bit of the
yes, yeah, there's a similar situation. Yeah. But there's one, and then there's another tower there,
And this is your most recent gallery show?
Yes, last November.
Last November.
But the idea of how a space gets kind of manipulated, the space gets manipulated, I hope, by the work. And maybe surprisingly, I would hope surprisingly so, where it can sort of stretch the space or condense the space or bring different rhythms of how the space is, you know.
I imagine that it was a real challenge for you, seeing how small the footprint of that gallery is.
No, it was really similar, you know, to using, not similar in scale, but the fact that suddenly the Pay Gallery, we were saying when we were working in there the other day, it suddenly seemed to have shrunk. And I think that's a very odd thing that can happen.
Why. Can you talk a little bit about the awnings? And then I think we might...
Yes, just...
Yeah, I'm getting the 5-minute signal.
I just wanted
these are so
to...
like baby. I mean, they look so teeny tiny now.
Yeah. It's very simple. It's about appropriating a wonderful structure that I'd first seen in New York in about 2001. These very solid awnings that are often, I think, in London, much things that you actually pull out and put away, you know, but they seem to have these more solid structures. And then I just let it roll on from there as an idea, and I sort of almost combined it with a flag-like element.
Well, I was wondering, do you think maybe it was also the Chrysler building? Do you think that had any kind of bearing?
Yes, it could. I mean,
those
I think
eagles, the deco eagles that kind of
come
jut
out. Yes, yeah. I think it's all those prosthetic architectural devices that fascinate me, and you know, things that are added on or taken away from buildings that this looks quite strange, this photograph, because that's
looks
actually
like it's floating. Yeah, it looks like it's floating in the middle of the space.
And then here's a whole series of the small sculptures that come from the small studio.
Those are great.
And trying to make the plinth become an object in its own right by painting it and treating it in the same way as the object that goes on it. But the materials are all, you know, plaster, clay, cement, very, very basic materials.
Were these the same that were in the show at New York?
Yes, yes. Mm.
Currently on view. Okay, I think you know what, I think we'll stop there and then open it up to some questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So we have mics on either side of the room. If you'd like to ask a question, you can open up to Phyllida here.
Lights are very bright.
Phyllida,
Hi there.
how are you doing? I'm curious as to your process, as how your artwork goes from the sketch to the finished product. Just how you get the materials and who puts it together, and do they know what the space? Do you know what the space is going to be that you're making it for, or do you just sort of fit it into it later, or does it go, you know, a lot of different ways as far as your process is concerned?
I think there are different ways, but I think I'm a very traditional artist where the drawing process is incredibly important, and so is the small sculpture process. They're not maquettes in the sense that they're not things that then become made bigger, but there's a process of information being passed down and then culminating in, if there's going to be a way in which that information, the drawings and then the small sculptures are going to inform a much larger sculpture, that's the way it happens. And by the time it becomes a large sculpture, I will often do very particular kinds of drawings for the large studio where I have these assistants who I work with. It's really, I suppose in some ways, a kind of collaboration. And one of the things that we've had to come to terms with is the fact that with the pink stage that was in Munich, that was a sort of learning curve which I'm still on, which is if work is going to last of this size, there's got to be a way in which I up my technical awareness of this, because I suppose I have often just gone to spaces in the past just with bundles of timber and tape and very ephemeral kinds of ways of making, because there hasn't really been a necessity for the work to last. But now, because I have the support of a gallery, which is incredible, that there is a need to respect that and to improve my technical ability so the work doesn't just end up in the local dump, you know, it actually has a life beyond the exhibition. And that's meant to a juggling act between retaining the way I like to make something, but also upping the technical process. So that working with the assistants in the large studio is really, really important, working very closely with them, often having to demonstrate ways of making, but at the same time being able to use the technical expertise of my studio manager for how these things should be. But one thing's interesting is that we often get halfway along with making the work, so I'm making it in a way which is very quick and immediate, and then we have to completely take it apart and begin again, introducing into that a more substantial technical method which keeps the work upright or whatever it might be, prevents it from falling over. So that's an ongoing thing that's happening and has happened for the last 3 years. But in my smaller studio, I still retain very direct ways of making the work. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I was struck by a little bit of a similarity between like how Chihuly will do a sketch and then someone else will bring it into three-dimensional form and glass form.
No, I don't, the sketches aren't, they're not for them to interpret. It's for me to make that crucial, I have to be the crucial link between the drawing and how to collaborate with a team of people in how it can come into realization. The drawing isn't an instruction, if that makes sense. Yeah. Mm. And I don't want to end up doing that. Do you know what I mean? I don't want to just ring a manufacturer and say, here it is, get on. I want to retain something that has a very specific origin that's from me, you know, and that I have to, in a way, have some form of negotiating that with my team. Hi, hello.
Do you approach a gallery and then if they want you to exhibit there, do they then pay for you to do this? Because it's very expensive, I imagine, to create these.
Yes, it is. Yes, it's become more expensive. No, the gallery, and there's a representative from my gallery here, which is Hauser and Wirth, and I was approached by them in 2010. But before then, I'd never had a gallery at all.
Is it similar to like when writers they get an advance, so you get an advance?
Yes, exactly like that. Yes, yeah.
Okay. And then you alluded to the fact that now some of or most of these things are being kept alive in some way. So they are being stored somewhere?
Yes. Yes, they are at vast expense. Yeah.
Long Island, London, Switzerland.
A lot in the States, actually. States has been very, very good to me. I'm very grateful, and I haven't really, I haven't had a gallery before 2010, so the experience of being with a very high-profile gallery is extraordinary in the support. But it has meant I've had to understand how I've made things up until that point in relationship to that kind of support that you're talking about. It has to be respected, and that has meant trying to hold on to this certain way of making, which is very rooted in, say, arte povera or artists like Eva Hesse, where you're constantly trying out things and not quite knowing what the consequence is, which isn't exactly a very economically viable way of doing things if the things constantly deteriorate and break. So it's like retaining that and enjoying the accidents and the breakages and the things falling over and the work revealing things to you, to me, that I can then go on with, but actually knowing that that isn't something that is necessarily something somebody wants to have in their own home when it starts behaving like that. So it's an interesting it's an interesting place to be at the moment, and also something that I'm still learning about. If that answers you, yeah.
So I'm not quite sure how to form this into a question, but I'm interested in how sometimes the work, maybe in a smaller form, seems a little bit like compositional. You're thinking about how there's texture, this form goes against another kind of material or shape, and then in some of the larger pieces, how like that one in Dallas where there are those plywood sheets sort of describing space, almost like a cubist painting going back, and that moment when there's that shift between object and space, if you keep them separate, or if you're interested in that moment when there's that shift, or I don't know quite how to formulate.
Yeah, no, I'm really interested in it, but I think the small studio, there's an intimacy about being able to work in that way, which becomes theatricalized when I get a bigger space. I just sort of, it's something I'm interested in. So there is there are two very contrasting ways of working. One, I think, which is very much to do with my hands, if you like, and is very controllable. And I think it goes back decades now. It goes back to something to do with knowing that maybe I only had 4 hours in the studio when with a young family, and having to be very decisive and organized, which I'm very grateful for, actually. And then the opposite almost with a large space where there could be an expansion away from that, which was almost to do with the idea of performance and audience becoming kind of protagonists. They become part of that adventure or that would be my ideal. I mean, maybe they just walk past it and say, I hate that stuff, and walk on, but my ideal would be that it's very active in that way. So it's two completely contrasting. I don't know where that shift is from object to stage, but I think in some of these works, I've tried to address that with the smaller, with these plinths and shelves and things which are, I hope, an integrated part of the object. This is extraordinary. It looks like a wolf, but it's it's not at all. It's just looks like a completely, I quite like that wolf-like look.
Phyllida, we have one more question and then we'll wrap up for the evening. Questions right here.
Oh, hi.
Hi, how are you? Thank you so much. I want to ask you about color.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't want to give you any limitations, just what you think. I love the bright. And then I noticed you have real dark as well, and I just would ask you to speak to that.
Color comes from, for me, from the street. It's the color of alerting us to information. So I've used color that comes straight out of the paint tin or is ready, prepared with brightly colored cloths. Or tape, anything that comes ready colored I will use. But it's not, it's about attention seeking. It's not subtle in that respect. Although I think when it comes to the drawings, and although the drawings are often using paint, I call them drawings, they're like colored drawings. I think often then the color is quite, can be quite watered down or a bit more, it has more subtlety in a way. Maybe that comes from a love of landscape. And I think the love of landscape is because I think things in a landscape, especially flat landscape, take on this incredible sculptural quality.